reading books and chatting to people.
I just outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Introducing Reading Solutions UK, home to Dreambox Reading Plus, the online reading development programme, improving outcomes for students and schools nationwide. Create stronger readers in your school from Key Stage 2 to beyond GCSE, using Reading Plus's evidence-based adaptive technology. Reading Plus accurately assesses your students' skills gaps and places them on a personalised learning pathway, built to accelerate their strengths and improve on their areas for development. You can try the program with a free 4-week pilot today. Search Reading Solutions UK to find their website and request your free pilot today.
Good evening, everybody, or good morning, depending on where in the world you are watching this right now. And welcome to Teachers Talk Radio for a special show. We are going to be looking at the importance of assessment at Key Stage 3 in English, and we're exploring particularly the usefulness and impact of reading assessments in Key Stage 3. And we've got some fantastic guests to discuss this topic with us this evening, an esteemed panel, one might say. We've got Charlotte Brabants, who is a whole school literacy coordinator in London. We've got Nick Mills, who's reading development consultant for Reading Solutions UK. And we've got our very own Dr. Christopher Bowles, who is a head of English at a UK independent senior school. And joining me to co-host this show, this extravaganza on reading, is the wonderful Michelle Hines. Say hello, Michelle.
Hi, everyone. I'm looking forward to tonight.
Super. Absolutely. We really are looking forward to it. Now, just before we get started with the conversation, it would be great just to say thank you very much if you've started watching this live. We appreciate it. If you want to get involved in the conversation, because we are live, you can very easily do that by tweeting us or by leaving a comment on YouTube, and we'll put that up on screen. And of course, join the conversation. We'll read out your comment, or we'll get involved. That's what it's all about here. It's certainly not a closed shop. So yeah, that would be fantastic. Now, I'm going to hand over to Michelle now. Michelle, tell us a little bit about your, I was going to say view of reading, maybe your feeling about reading.
So at the moment, I'm Key Stage 3 lead for English. So I think tonight for me is really relevant. And we, as a Key Stage 3 lead and a secondary school teacher, there are some serious concerns when it comes to reading. And one of the concerns is fluency. And we find that our students are not necessarily reading. They call words, they ignore the punctuation, they therefore can't answer the comprehension questions. And so there's a growing gap that we've discovered in the reading ages. And so by the time they get to Key Stage 4, because some of us don't have the expertise to address those gaps, or the school doesn't invest in programs to assist with that, they get to Key Stage 4 and they can't access the texts. And the text, there's no differentiation or adaptive texts when it gets to Key Stage 4 and 5. They have to read and decode and understand it. And so it is so important that, that gap from Key Stage 2 to 3, I don't know if it's a lack of consistency, or when they come to us in the secondary school, we treat them as blank slates, but whatever it is, hopefully tonight we'll get some insight into that.
Super. Well, I'm going to hand you over to you now, because you are the deputy head of English. I am a a part-time history teacher. So you are definitely way more qualified than me at this point.
Oh, thank you so much, Tom. And I just like to say welcome as well. And I've been looking forward to this all week, all day. So before we even get into the questions as they relate to the Reading Solution Program, could you kindly define for us what reading truly means? What is reading? What does that look like? Charlotte, do you want to start us off?
It's a good question, isn't it? I mean, you can talk about the absolute functional definition of being able to create meaning out of letters and words on a page, but you very rightly point out the punctuation lends a lot of meaning. So you need to be able to interpret from letter, but from word to chunk to sentence to paragraph, because all of the written marks are conveying some sense of meaning to us. And it's whether you're lingering over the words that are being used and the structure, you're just picking up the actual information.
I think you're dropping a little bit.
At its most basic, it's making meaning from those marks. I think we're concerned at the Key Stage 3 level with getting students to be able to.
Yes, I think Charlotte's Wi-Fi is acting up. So, Nick, would you like to carry on for us?
Yeah, I'll carry on. I mean, I'll just build on what Charlotte's just said. I mean, reading, it's a great question. It should have an easy answer, but it doesn't. I mean, we read every single day, but it is a complex cognitive skill. And it requires the integration of multiple processes. And if you think about, those processes, we have decoding, we have vocabulary knowledge. What's quite interesting is the gaps within vocabulary knowledge as well, particularly within the UK. And those gaps are linked to socioeconomic groupings as well. Fluency, as you quite rightly say, is a big part of that, and I want to focus a little bit on fluency. We call it the hidden hurdle at Reading Solutions. We believe reading fluently, reading with automaticity, is probably the most important aspect. We would say that obviously because we deal with fluency, but fluency is about reading with understanding. And when students read, it's not just about reading and recognizing the words and the letters. It's about applying their knowledge and their understanding. And I think that's really important because we see too many young people reading quickly with no understanding. Mm-hmm. And we live in a system, an education system, where young people at the end of each of their key stages have to go into an exam hall, and they have to open up an exam paper and they have to read quite lengthy materials, a lot of complex vocabulary, and they have to apply their knowledge, and they have to engage with that. So I think there's the process. I think there's the purposes of reading as well. I mean, reading, as well, you acquire new knowledge, you learn new concepts, it's entertaining. We all read for pleasure. I think there's a critical aspect to it in terms of critical thinking, which I think builds lifelong skills for learners, and communication as well, to interpret messages and to communicate effectively. So I hope that's answered the question.
Yes, very comprehensive. Thank you so much. And just some key things there is the hidden hurdle, that level of fluency, and making sure that they're reading for meaning. Very, very important. Chris, do you want to chip in from your perspective? How would you define reading?
Well, I would certainly point our listeners and viewers to the Ofsted Reading Framework document, which was published in 2023, which gives Ofsted's perspective on what reading is. And I quite like their approach, actually. It divides reading into those two skill areas that we've heard Nick talking about, really, which is language comprehension and decoding or word reading. So if you're hoping to do any effective teaching of reading in the secondary sector, you certainly need to have a good understanding of those differences in process that we've just had described to us. The difference between reading in primary school and reading in secondary school is quite pronounced. So the shift from children reading in year 6 to children reading in year 7 is quite a significant jump. In year 6, a group of students might be reading with a single teacher in a single room all day. Whereas, of course, by the time they move into secondary school, they can often be reading in as many as 14 or 15 different classrooms with 14 or 15 different people. And reading in each of those subject areas will have its own specific domain requirements of those students. So one can imagine reading is a much, much more tiring process in early secondary than it is even in late primary.
Yeah, that's a great point, Chris. Actually, can I just add to that, Michelle, if that's okay? That's a great point. Actually, a great point. It's the automaticity that we want. And I think you're right in terms of the changes and the differences between primary and secondary. When you're going to multiple classrooms and you are reading a different range of texts, the text that you're exposed to. And, we did a white paper in 2023 where we consulted with over 100 schools and senior leaders. And that's the one thing, Chris, that they were telling us about, the different range of texts, the academic texts, having to read for different purposes and obtaining that knowledge. So absolutely agree with you. And you're right about Ofsted. Ofsted brilliant documents every year. They're telling us, they're giving us help and advice, and that reading framework, it has fluency and automaticity written all over it.
Thank you so much. So recently I attended a conference, and one of the workshops was on teaching fluency, and it was led by the head of English in a primary setting. And I chose to go to that workshop because I wanted to see what really took place in the primary setting. And it was very intense. I mean, they had choral reading and teacher was modeling and lots happened. But then the students come to the secondary school and it's not as intense. We just take it for granted that they should know these things already. So that leads me to the next question, which according to the findings from your research, the reading ages of year 7 students are on the decline. So my question is, based on your personal experience, do you think the Key Stage 2 assessment data is valuable? Is it providing enough for that transition to secondary schools?
Okay.
Any member of the panel could answer, please.
Well, I'll answer it because I used to, in a former life, I was a senior deputy head of 2 secondary schools, and I used to oversee reading, and we used to get the Key Stage 2 SAT results, and they would tell us whether or not a student was secondary ready. Of course, you've got to be careful when you look at the SAT results, because the 2 components now for those SAT results are reading, the reading score, and the maths score. And they're put together, and, I don't know whether you'll know about Progress 8, but all of a sudden, those students now have estimated attainments. One of the things that we found really interesting was, what do you do with a student that has a scale score of 120, but has a scale score of 80 in reading? And then their average attainment score is a level 4, a grade 4, a grade 5. So straight away we could see issues with that. But every year we would test the students. We would look, because we weren't believing the data. Now 91% of our respondents from our white paper actually said that they are administering their own baselines. We would routinely baseline our year 7s on entry, and we would get large groups of students that had chronological reading ages 3 to 4 years lower than their chronological reading age, but they were secondary ready in terms of the reading score. Yeah. So there were those observations. So, and because reading is part of the primary, reading is a huge part of what primary education does. The standards in primary school are fantastic. The students are coming in with quite rightly so. You look at the level of work that goes in our primary schools, but you get a scale score, you don't get anything else. It doesn't tell you anything about, can that student make inferences? Can that student summarize? What's the retrieval like? Are they able to point? So all you're getting is a scale score. What do you do with that? And that's the dilemma for I think that many secondary senior leaders face.
Yeah, thank you so much. You've actually mentioned a little bit on my second question, but let me just ask him if you could elaborate a little bit more on the implications for secondary schools, especially with regards to Progress 8. What is the impact on that? If you could elaborate a little bit, please.
Well, I mean, again, it's that estimated attainment from coming in from year 6 into secondary school, and you have those estimated attainments, and the students have to attain those grades to make average progress. And again, it comes down to the robustness of the data and the scores. And again, you've got an average between maths and reading. And what happens when you've got a student that has a higher score in one and a lower score in the other? So that is the real issue, I think. Progress 8 as well. I mean, when I look at Progress 8, I make reference as well. I don't just look at Progress 8 in isolation. I look at Progress 8 in terms of all the other curriculum reforms that have taken place in the last 10 to 15 years. The students now, all of the subjects have changed. Their curriculums are much more, there's much more content within they're much more rigorous. The exams are usually terminal. There's a huge increase of tier 2, tier 3 vocabulary. And then you've got these estimated grades. And I think there's a real pressure on schools and educators to really accelerate progress. But again, it comes down to how do you make impact in a school? You have to have a really good conceptual understanding of the barriers to learning. You really have to understand, is it fluency? Is it vocabulary? What exactly is it? Do the students need more phonics? Because 9 times out of 10 years ago, if you were a struggling reader, you would just get put on a phonics program within secondary schools. Actually, what's actually happening is that secondary schools now are catching up, and you said, you mentioned expertise. There has been a general lack of expertise around reading within secondary schools. Everybody sees it as the remit of the English department, and it's not. Yes, so Progress 8's huge. It is a real shift. I understand why Progress 8 was introduced, because it's a fairer measure in terms of measuring progress and measuring distance travelled and value added. But it comes back to the robustness of the tests. And, are the tests a true reflection? And what I found in my career is they weren't.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we have a question from Adriana. What about EAL students and the increase in numbers in secondary schools? How are we catering for them as well? Do they impact on the outcomes as well in these tests? So Charlotte, don't know if you'd like to start us off first, and Chris, I'd love to hear from you.
Well, they definitely do. I mean, I'm coming from a school where we have the numbers on record are 74% for us are considered EAL. And that's largely because their home languages aren't English. That doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have some fluency, whether it's acquired here or as a language acquisition through just speaking. But one of the things that we're seeing more and more of every year in the past 5 years, it started really before COVID. The area where my school is an area where lots of refugees and asylum seekers are either placed or come. So we're seeing lots of unaccompanied asylum seekers with not just EAL, but with no English. And that becomes quite a difficult thing to capture. When you're talking about reading, we're starting from the very, very beginning, teaching the basics of the English alphabet. And we're talking about some students who probably, or quite often we know, they don't have high levels of literacy in their home countries or in their home languages. So there is a real impact. I think when you talk about EAL, you need to be able to take into account the nuances there. One of the good things, though, that we've found when we were using other systems to assess reading and to try and support reading, phonics obviously comes in there. But if you're trying to do one of the traditional tests and somebody doesn't speak any English, you're sort of at a loss to get any sort of insight into what they can do. But with some of the things that we can use now with our online platform, with Reading Plus, we can use the visual skills. We can start supporting vocabulary straight away. So that does have an impact. Yeah. But definitely EAL numbers that are increasing, and we see that coming up from the primary schools as well. It's a real challenge.
Thank you. Thank you so much. In my current setting, it is definitely a challenge, and that is why my school is actually turning to other programs and platforms to support the increase in our EAL learners. Chris, in your context, do you find the Key Stage 2 assessment valuable or of use when they come over to secondary school?
Well, because I'm in the independent sector, we don't have Key Stage 2 data at all. So as soon as children come into our school, we conduct our own series of baseline literacy skills tests, essentially. And the good thing about those is it gives us a fairly accurate measure on how students perform at sentence level and how they perform with vocabulary. But the missing piece of the jigsaw there really is that wider sense of comprehension. And I suppose if we were looking forward to the 22nd century, in terms of how we manage EAL students, it would be really good if we could have some kind of reading program that could test students' reading abilities in their home languages alongside English. So we could actually know if a student was able to comprehend a paragraph in Romanian or French or Japanese or any other world language that you might be dealing with, and then use that knowledge they have from their home language to apply to the teaching of their English language curriculum, really. I mean, I work in a school where we recruit from 6 continents on the planet. So we have students from every single major language group you can think of. And we introduce them into mainstream as quickly as we can, but there has to be some sensitivity in how we do that. And we have to be quite careful about how quickly we move some who've only been in the country for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I think ultimately we need to go back to basics and ensure that the secondary school teachers are also equipped with the skills and the knowledge to promote reading and reading fluently as well, because I think that's where the gap is. And we try these add-ons and, we try to go with what we think is right, but it's so important that we collaborate with our primary colleagues as well.
Can I just say as well, you mentioned EL students, if they don't have any Key Stage 2 reading data, they will not count in Progress 8. So that you've got to have that baseline. The other thing as well is many EL students come from cultures where they don't read left to right. That efficient reading, from left to right, they don't have that. What I would say, not just with EL students, but with all students, you've got to practice that. If you don't, it's like my golf swing. If I don't practice and I go and play golf on a Sunday and I go around in 120, you've got any sport set, you've got to, and it's the same with reading. Reading is a skill, okay? You've got to practice. That scanning, that efficient left to right scanning is part of that process. And, one of the things that Reading Plus use is a guided window to help the students, that visual perceptual span and efficient reader. We have spent, a lot of researching the eye movements of inefficient readers. You get regressions, you get fixations, you get over decoding. What that actually ends up happening, students get cognitive overload, because by the time they've read something, just with their eye movements and their regressions, we're then asking them to comprehend text and then answer questions and assess them and to test them and to grade them on that. So I just wanted to make that point, if that was okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That was very helpful. And somebody asked, what programs do you use? And I think you've answered that as well. The reading solutions, that's what we're talking about tonight for those who are listening and those who've just joined. Thank you so much. So we'll get into that a little bit more in part 3 of the discussion. And just to round up part 1 of our discussion, you've already mentioned, Nick, about the 91% of respondents who said that that they found that the tests weren't as robust as possible, that schools are now having to resort to their own baseline tests. So my question is, how reliable are those baseline tests that secondary schools use? Because I'm not sure there's a standard baseline test, because I created one for my year 7s, and I'm not sure any other school uses it. So how do we then measure and determine how robust they are?
Oh, that's a great question. It is a difficult question to answer. I mean, there's some brilliant baselines out there. There's some standardized tests. The gold standard seems to be the NGRT test that a lot of schools use. What I would say in relation to that is that it depends what your priority is. Now, if you just want to test the readability or get a chronological reading age and to test the readability so that you can then use that in the classroom, that's fine. You know, NGRT looks at comprehension, etc. But what it doesn't do, what some of the tests don't do is it's the fluency measure. And a lot of tests might measure fluency just by getting you to time you to read a passage, but it's that understanding. So what I would say, you know, a lot of schools use that because of the standardized results. What we're finding now with the schools that we are working with is they are moving over to our insight assessment. I know Charlotte mentioned that earlier on. Our insight assessment is heavily weighted towards comprehension understanding. So it measures vocabulary. It gives students a year-related score, comprehension in terms of text complexity and readability, but it focuses on words per minute. So it's looking at comprehension based reading speed, but with understanding. And one of the things our program does, it can give you year-related expectations, so it can benchmark your progress. So I think it's good that schools are using GL, you know, NGRT. I think that's great, but it comes down to what's going to have the biggest impact on your outcomes in terms of moving students forward with their learning. And this is why a lot of schools now are using our insight assessment, because of the importance of fluency within the curriculum.
Thank you. So Charlotte, you've already started using it. Could you give us some more insight into practically how it's working for your school?
Sure. Well, we implemented Reading Solutions last year across the whole school after doing a pilot, and we transitioned from the STAR test, which is part of Renaissance, and had done some sort of spotty correlation with some other tests. And when we moved to the insight assessment, obviously there were, you know, implementation things that we had to overcome. And one of the big ones is supporting the staff in understanding and making that leap to a new measure and being able to effectively use all the pieces. But really quickly last year, it became that fluency piece became so clear. I was at a year 8 parents evening trying to explain to the parents, because one of the things that we find very useful about it is the way that you can structure your conversations both with students and with parents to support the use of the program, and then the very clear progress lines that when students are using it, you can map out. But it became very clear in this conversation when students had quite low comprehension or overall proficiency scores that fluency was a key missing piece of the puzzle for them. And parents would be very alarmed to see this very low level, but you could correlate it directly to this difficulty or inefficiency or lack of stamina in terms of the student's fluency. And once we could start to demonstrate that progress being made, we could see the comprehension coming up. We do use it in a variety of ways. This year, we've refined now what we're going to be doing. And so we're pulling out different pools. We're pulling out the students who are, you know, low fluency and therefore low comprehension, but we're also pulling out the students who might look a little more proficient, but clearly have deficits in their vocabulary figure. So there are all sorts of ways we can use the tool, but that fluency comprehension correlation was just absolutely so clear, and it just drove the conversations that we had. And by the end of last year, we saw tremendous progress across the school in every year group. What's really interesting this year from the assessments, which are nearly done, is that the students who did it last year, who didn't, maybe there was an assessment bias, maybe there was, you know, not the kind of rigor that we needed in the way that we did it, but the students who they're coming in and this autumn term benchmark is higher than last year's autumn term benchmark. Maybe that's used from last year. We're not quite sure what that is, but we can see we're already starting from a higher benchmark than we were last year. And that includes our New Year 7s.
Oh, fantastic. That's excellent news for those who are piloting the program or those who are considering it. That is really good to see that it is being trialed. It has been trialed, and there is some progress. That's really good to know. So Nick, a part of the program, the way it's advertised, that it's adaptive. Could you explain to us the adaptive aspect of it, please? Because that's a buzzword at the moment.
Well, the good thing is that the adaptive nature of the program means that in terms of a teacher and a senior leader, you don't need to do anything. What the program will do is it will assess the students' reading proficiency. It will break it down into the different components. It will put the students onto a personalized program within the program. It will make sure that the texts that the students have access to have appropriate challenge and readability. We use Lexiles. One of the biggest issues that staff tell us, what senior leaders tell us, and again, I'm referring to our white paper, is engagement and building stamina. So we make sure that, you know, students are given the right word count. Mm-hmm. The program very quickly will determine whether or not the students need to go into fluency focus. So they're reading too slowly or they're reading too quickly. We have a lot of boys that read really quickly, but they don't read with understanding. Equally, what the program will also do is it will look at the text complexity. It will make the decisions and adapt. It decrease, increase the text complexity. It has this wonderful feature called the guided window. So when the students are reading, they read with a guided window. So I'm teaching my young son he's in year 3. I'm using my finger to read. As soon as I take that finger off, he's all over the place. That's like the guided window. It's around about 20 to 25 characters. And again, it's the visual perceptual span of an efficient reader. So the students will read with the guided window, and then it's a release method. It's then released and they read independently. Mm-hmm. If the students are struggling, because that speed is bespoke to the student, but the program knows what the year-related expectation is. So it's pacing the students to get to that speed, but it won't let them until they've shown consistency on the program. And they do that by getting combos, reading 2 texts. And again, the amount of texts that they read is highly personalized. There's visual prompts, there's page breakers within the program, but what the program will do, it will slow the students down and it will make those adaptations, and that's really, really powerful. It will put the students in support mode, and it will give the educators, it will give the senior leaders and the teachers real-time data. So as the students are interacting with the interface, you're getting that immediate feedback in terms of what the students are reading. And we've done that on purpose. We've done that to reduce teacher workload. We know that teacher workload is absolutely, and expertise within fluency is a huge issue moving forward for schools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. I saw Charlotte nodding away in agreement about the adaptive aspect of the program. So that sounds brilliant. And based on your description, Nick, I'm sure it will also build the students' confidence, because I find a lot of times, the students, they lack the confidence in reading as well, or reading aloud.
They do. I mean, the worst thing you can do with a student, particularly, is give them a piece of information, a piece of text to read that's too complicated. It will destroy them. And I've seen that in my own experience, where you ask somebody to read or you present information. And again, I'll go back to the point I made earlier. Reading is the remit of the English department. It's not. It affects but how do you change your practice within a classroom? So I was a history teacher, Tom, for 28 years.
I was about to say, it is the responsibility of the English department.
It is.
We don't want anything to do with that. You guys, you do what you do. We'll do what we do. We do the dates. We do the figures. We do all that stuff.
Yeah, but Tom, how will they access the sources in history if we don't help?
But can I ask you a question, Tom? When you got the reading age of a student, right, presented to you, what did you do to change your practice?
Well, I mean, the most obvious thing is I mean, to be fair, I've just worked in a special school where the reading ages were lower primary in most cases. So, and that's every student there. There might have been maybe the odd one who was at secondary, maybe lower secondary level. So my entire teaching changed. But in answer to your question, nothing to do with the history department.
Yeah, absolutely. And also,
no, it's not absolutely. You're supposed to disagree with that.
But even the text, even using textbooks, have the texts, the information that we're providing, even exam boards, have they been written to develop reading? And see, all of the texts within our library, I mean, we have 1,300 texts within our library, 80 to 90 texts per level. All of the texts have been written not just to broaden horizons, to build cultural capital for the students, but they've been written to develop reading. So in terms of tier 3 vocabulary, if you're reading a text that's got a really low Lexile score, you're going to have greater frequency of those command words and that complex vocabulary within the texts. So and that, for me, I think that's a bigger issue than what for us as a panel. But I think there's a broader issue just in terms of resource and what we present as children.
Thank you so much. Tom, do we have time to move on to part 2 before a break? Do we continue?
Well, I will. Well, I will very briefly, just for 30 seconds, remind everybody what Reading Solutions is and how you can get it, because I know Nick at the end is going to mention that you can actually benefit from a 4-week free pilot. That's right, Nick, isn't it?
It is, yeah. We're so confident.
Yeah, and if you're watching this on desktop, then you can scan that, and you can scan it, and it'll take you straight to the page where the free trial can be accessed. If you're not watching on desktop, then just visit Reading Solutions website and you can find it there, and you can get your 4-week free trial of everything we're discussing today. If you've got further interest, but I'll pass back to Michelle.
Thank you very much. And just before I move on to my questions in part 2, more schools are moving away from making the literacy coordinator English teachers these days. So I think that is such a good move, because it's always the English department's responsibility. So hopefully more history teachers will become literacy coordinators, PE teachers, you name it, so that we all take ownership. But thank you very much, panelists, for your insightful discussion so far. We've talked a little bit about the challenges of reading assessments. But could we now talk about some of the benefits? What are some of the benefits of reading assessments? Chris, I'm going to start with you, actually. What would you consider some of the benefits of the reading assessments?
Well, I think it's quite an interesting question, really. I suppose the primary benefit of reading assessments is that you know roughly where your children are when they come in, and how you think you'd like them to develop, although there are some particular challenges that I'd be interested to know about when it comes to screen-based reading assessments, and how you ensure that a student's weaknesses with IT skills aren't kind of flagged up in the test rather than their competence with reading. I mean, that's something I've seen in a primary school that I'm attached to as a governor, where children have struggled with the IT aspects of a reading assessment at year 6, and then have struggled to give a really good account of their reading skills as a consequence. So I wondered how that fitted into what Nick does. But I suppose, the primary benefit really is if you've got standardized data that everybody in your departments understand, and that they can actually take intelligent pedagogical decisions based on that information about how they teach those children.
Thank you. And Nick, just before you respond to that, just to add to what you said, Chris, I've had students at the end of an NGRT test, for instance, saying, "Oh, miss, I finished that in 2 minutes. I just clicked blindly."
Yeah.
And so it skews the outcome. So
they can't do that on Reading Plus because of the adaptive nature of the program. It will know if they're doing that, and it will put them on hold, and it will give the teacher instruction to speak to them. But I think you've raised a great question, Chris. I don't know whether I've got an answer for it. But what I would say is we're not looking to replace books, certainly not. We're looking to aid and improve reading efficiency and fluency, and it's that transition from that tool into reading, as a lifelong skill. But we do have to recognize that the vast majority of reading that young people do in the 21st century is on a screen.
Can I just say, and this makes me sound really, really bad, probably, but 98% of my reading is on a screen. I can't remember the last time I read a paper-based book. Bye, everyone.
It's okay, Tom. I think
it's okay. Let's turn this into a therapy session. It's okay.
Now, with the advent of the Kindle and all these other devices, people stop turning pages. But for me, I love turning the pages and smelling that brand new book. I am still that era.
I have a feeling Chris will agree with you. I have a sneaky feeling.
Well, and I will as well. I'm not just the whole school. I'm a reformed English teacher. I'm the librarian. I'm the transition coordinator. I have lots of jobs. And I definitely, and we do a lot to encourage to make that transition from the online platform, which we say is reading, deliberate, structured, independent reading practice to get better, to be able to enjoy more reading of books and pages.
Yes. And could I just add to what Chris said, and back to what you said as well, Nick? So Chris spoke about the students not being able to access the IT or to manipulate it. Hence, it causes problems with how they access the test. And then the point was made that most of them are exposed to reading online anyway. I don't think that's the issue. It's the digital literacy. And you'd be surprised to know how many of our students do not know how to navigate the basics on a computer. They can access social media and they can do all these fancy things with all Snapchat and whatever. But ask them to make a Word document and they flounder. Miss, how do I do that?
So I find the opposite. As I get older, I find it harder to do things like that on computers. I mean, Reading Plus is so adaptive. It is simple. I mean, it's a click. It is a click. But you're right about digital literacy. Not just in digital, but literacy, health literacy, for example. People being able to access that information just to make everyday decisions. No, you're absolutely right.
Yeah. Thank you. So I'm just going to move on to my other question with regards to reading assessments. And according to the RSUK Key Stage 3 white paper, almost 40% of the survey respondents reported that assessing reading was more difficult than ever. So my question to you is, and I'm going to go to you first, Charlotte, what makes a good reading assessment? What are the key components, you think?
I think you need to be able to assess a number of reading elements, components at the same time. For me, in a big secondary school where staff time is really precious, to be able to do it efficiently with that real-time output, that's really key. And to be able to act on it. I've used things before where it gives you a score, but it doesn't really say what you can do with it. And it doesn't tell you what, where do you need to focus? You might see that this score is low, but what is the intervention needed? So you really need to be able to look at all of those things. And, what we found with the Insight assessment is we can do it efficiently. The students are pretty independent and able to manage. We don't really seem to have too many IT issues. We get that immediate feedback. We do see that thing that sort of they've learned. I want to look at the words on the page and I want to move on. And we can see that when they move from the guided window to the independent window, where they say, well, miss, I've read it. Well, you've looked at the words on the screen, but you haven't understood them. And that discussion really, really helps us inform the students' understanding of what it is they're meant to be doing as a reading activity, as well as our understanding. So it gives us all of those elements at once. It's not just a score. And that's what I think has been so valuable for us. And really pushed our how we're implementing and how we're starting to do other things across the school.
Well, one of the things I hated as a teacher was marking, because I'm going to be honest, it just took me forever to mark, particularly mock exams. And I am an examiner for AQA, so it's a laborious process. But automated systems, ed tech systems, can mark so quickly and give you that QLA analysis at a click of a button. And what you can do with that as a strategic leader is you can have those conversations about resource, because again, that's one of the issues that we need to talk about, I think, as well. Resource within the education system, and you know, in reading interventions tend to be very labor intensive. You know, and you do intervention work, and again, how do you improve reading? You know, unless you've got experts in every single classroom, you do it through intervention work. So that's one of the huge benefits of using technology.
And I agree with you, Nick. Marking can be laborious, but for some strange reason, I enjoy it because I like to see the outcome. I like to see if the students are grasping what I've taught. Sorry, Tom, I'm such a geek. I was marking today, and I just want to.
I'm joking, Michelle. Some very strange people do enjoy it, and you can be one of them.
But it's the time it takes. It's the time it takes, Michelle. You know, I mean, not just. So I agree with you. You know, summative assessment. You know, marking, giving the students fit, changing your teaching practice, formative practices as well. But it's the time it takes, and there is a huge issue within the UK around teacher workload.
Yeah,
I want to know if Chris and Charlotte like marking.
I never liked marking. And I'm gonna say what I didn't like about it. And I think that what I don't like about it is you spend a lot of time marking, but you don't necessarily see students taking it on board. And so it quite often felt like feedback into, you know, just a vacuum. But what I like about being able to use the insight assessment, and I found it really useful, is that it directs the conversations that I have with students in a way that the students find useful and they can feed back to me. And I have told, you know, some of my colleagues at Reading Plus about some of the real successes I had last year with some boys who are considered naughty, who were able to do this in their own time and space, who were initially, you know, really recalcitrant and reluctant. But as they started to see progress, they took it on board and did more of it. And so by the end of the year, the conversations I was having with some of these very well known across the school boys for the wrong reasons, who had still moved up in terms of, you know, their proficiency, one of them was absolutely just beaming because he had gone from reading at the level of a year 3 or 4 student to at least being now secondary ready. And he was in year 9. And he was so, because he could take my feedback on board. It was that automated feedback that he could understand and turn into action. And that's why I didn't like marking it, is I don't think my students, maybe I was just a bad marker, but it didn't really seem like they took it into, you know, they took it on board and took action with it.
Yeah.
Thank you. You know, you have to force them to read your feedback and then you have to decode what you've written as well. So it is laborious.
But the point there that you've made, Charlotte, about the whole point of that process is engagement. And if you don't get the engagement and the buy-in from the students, it doesn't matter what you do in any curriculum area, you know, whether it's reading or whatever, you really are you're facing an uphill struggle. So engagement is absolutely key.
Totally agree. So I'm going to move on to vocabulary, which you mentioned briefly, Nick, at the start. So pardon me if I'm not going to make eye contact for a couple of minutes while I read something from the white paper. It said the relationship between vocabulary learning and reading comprehension is a reciprocal one, or vocabulary knowledge supports good reading comprehension. And at the same time, good reading comprehension offers opportunities to learn new word meanings. But the opposite is also true because, as we might expect, children with poor reading comprehensions typically have lower levels of vocabulary knowledge. Poor vocabulary limits access to texts, which reduces opportunities to learn new word meanings, and so on, and it's a vicious cycle. So my question to you, panelists, is what do you think are the root causes of poor vocabulary? Is this linked to spoken language development? And if so, how can it be addressed? Because I think parents have to get involved in this discussion and take some ownership as well. So, Nick, would you like to go first?
Oh, I'm still thinking about it. I mean, this could be a really controversial answer.
Well, let's go for it.
Well, I'll jump in
He's
while you're
rehearsing
thinking.
his controversial answer right now.
Yeah, he's trying to be a spin doctor at the same time. Go on, Charlotte.
I was just going to say, I mean, I don't think there is one cause. I do think part of it is, at home. I do think it is not a lot of, rich dialogue and exposure to lots of different kind of talk. I mean, I really do think spoken language is the key for all of this. And we've referenced before, if you're in a home environment where English isn't the main language, or, there's all sorts of things that I think lend to that. But I also think we're all aware of tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary, but how well is it taught? How explicitly is it taught? And because I also sort of have worked as a mentor with ECTs and doing all sorts of learning walks across departments, and the staff in those departments, this is probably, I think, why the English department tends to be seen as the home for reading and literacy. They don't necessarily feel confident or skilled in even how to model reading, let alone being able to teach vocabulary and all the things that they really need to do. And so I think some of the moves for real driven disciplinary literacy, which combines the vocabulary expertise with how you read, what a text looks like in different subjects, is really crucial. And I think that's where I think some of the secondary environments, we see that students aren't being supported, but are we supporting the staff to be able to support the students? And do staff know what to do with that data? I mean, so often I see, and I don't want to pick out history, so I'll choose another subject, but, in a different humanities subject, okay, here's some text, now read it. And they'll either have the student read it aloud, which we know could make lots of students cringe, or they just have the students read it silently. I do puzzle, and that's this year's goal, is to get people to understand why, you really need to make those opportunities for that reading and for that explicit vocabulary instruction. But I am aware that I've gone onto the disciplinary literacy banner, and it's not necessarily that's wider than just vocabulary.
Well said. Thank you so much, Charlotte. I heard the passion there, training the teachers so that they're confident to do that. Nick, are you ready to share with us? And then hear your thoughts.
I'm glad, it is the home environment. It is cultural,
Yeah.
There's no doubt about it. If you live in a house where you there's the oracy part of it as well, and the communication, and the culture, the learning culture within your house. There's no doubt about it, because that, for me, promotes engagement and intrinsic interest in reading. I think as well, you've got to see the value in reading and what it can do for you. I think, young people, they're not stupid. They know that if they can see the value in something and how it can benefit them, then they'll do it. Socioeconomic status does play a part in it, unfortunately. Children from lower socioeconomic groupings and backgrounds have far less access to books. So, we've seen what's happened during the COVID pandemic in terms of gaps in reading. Poor teaching, I have to say that, controversial. We've had examples of that tonight.
You'll have to tweet that one, Lucy, if you dare.
We've had examples of that, and again, when I say poor teaching, that could be, I'm just talking about teaching, I'm talking about textbooks, exam boards. I'm talking about a lack of expertise in reading, teacher training, the lack of focus on vocabulary. Although I think schools are getting better at teaching vocabulary, what we find is that the vocabulary levels are higher than the comprehension levels. So I think you're right to mention the tier 2, tier 3 vocabulary. For me, the big issue is engagement and culture.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, very well expressed. Completely agree with what both of you have said. And vocabulary is becoming more explicit in the curriculum, I've found. As a matter of fact, in some schools, it is now embedded in policy that you have to share your keywords and vocabulary. But sometimes you find that teachers will just get the students to copy the keywords and the definitions, and that's the end of that. Yeah. And when students are reading and they go, "Miss, what does this word mean?" I ask them to read the words around it. But sadly, they don't know what the words around it mean either. So there's another struggle. But yeah, it's an ongoing thing that we really have to work on. Chris, would you like to quickly share your own experience and tell us what do you think about vocabulary and how can
I also want to know from Chris's perspective, with Nick's list there, which bits do you sort of, agree with, disagree with? Is there anything there that is there any differentiation between yourself and Nick in what you think?
Not a huge deal. I mean, I'm going to read to you a sentence about the standard of English teaching in England. And it's this, from a very, very significant English report. It is desirable that the standard in English required for admission to training colleges should be raised. Anyone like to hazard a guess in which year that was printed?
This year?
Was that the 20th century?
1921, the landmark Newbolt English report, which is actually probably the reason why English teachers ever since have been lumbered with the job of teaching reading, because his report makes it very, very clear that it is the job of the English teacher to primarily teach children reading in state schools after the 1920s. And then it widens out beyond the English department to other departments too. But it's very, very clear that it's English teachers who are charged with that primary mission. And in fact, that's the same report essentially that gives birth to the English Association in the early 20th century. So people have always been moaning about the standard of English teachers in schools, and there's always areas where we can improve our teaching of the subject, both by harnessing the new technological tools that become available to us and working really, really hard on the pedagogical practice that we bring to our own classrooms.
Yeah, and Chris, just to say that pedagogical practice, where do you get that from? Who trains you to have that understanding? And I'm thinking about all the curriculum reforms that have taken place in the education system. I mean, I wasn't trained as a curriculum designer. So where does that knowledge come from?
Well, again, that's about subject communities, isn't it? I mean, the significance of subject research associations has risen over the last 10 years, I think, and it would be good if more of our teachers were members of those kinds of groups, and that there was a wider discussion about the tools available to all of the teachers in our schools who are always English teachers, as again was said in 1921. All teachers are teachers of English because all teachers are teachers in English, is what Newbolt tells us. So, yeah, it's got to come down to high quality CPD, good use of educational tools, and a wider conversation within the teaching community, I think.
Yeah.
Yes, and as Nick said earlier, teacher training as well. I think that needs to be looked at as well, because a number of teachers in the English departments I've worked in over the years, they said their training in the UK, for instance, is predominantly literature. So they're trained how to teach literature, and so they miss out on the linguistic elements. I remember once in an English department, I had to do CPDs on the basics of grammar, so that they were able to equip the students, because those were included in the lessons and in the schemes of work, but the teachers didn't really understand it themselves. So I think definitely teacher training as well as all the other factors. Thank you so much for that. Tom, do you want to add anything to that, or have you been converted yet? And we'll take some ownership.
I honestly don't need converting. I'm fully on board with what everyone said, really.
Of course.
Apart from making history teachers do more work, everything else I'm totally on board with. But what I would like to say is we have reached 1,000 viewers across all platforms. In fact, we're nearly up to 1,500. That's a lie. We're actually currently on 1,400. So thank you very much to everyone who's chosen to watch some or all of this session. Special shout out to Adriana, who has been watching from the word go and made several great little comments there. We haven't had a chance to read them all out, but thank you very much. And JBL as well, who's been watching all the way through. A few other people have commented on LinkedIn and Facebook. So thank you very much to everybody, and we hope you're getting something out of this. Just to circle back as well. If you don't know what we're talking about here, you can find out by visiting Reading Solutions UK. You can ask Nick, who is on screen now, Nick Mills. You can message him and ask him for the 4-week free pilot, or you can just sign up on the website. Get yourself 4 weeks for free, and then you can enjoy it and see what you think about what we're talking about and what Charlotte and Nick are talking about particularly. So just to, I'll move on now to a few questions, and this one interests me because it's specifically around what happens after assessments, after the assessments are done. So in the school, assessments have been done. So what are your next steps? And I guess this is firstly, pointed towards Charlotte. Also Chris, I'd love to hear from as well. I know Chris's situation is slightly different because it's an independent school and there might be slightly different assessments, etc. But when you get assessment data back, what are your next steps? What do you do with it?
Well, I'm going to just start with the insight assessment. It's not dissimilar to what we were doing before. Was okay. Here's what it says about your reading. Now let's get you reading, and now let's try and see if we can boost you. But what we found before was that there were not very many windows to intervene or to check when the process is going on, if that makes sense. You can't really tell when someone's reading a book how they're reading a book until they finish the book and then feed back to you. With Reading Plus, how we've implemented it is we're using it not just as an intervention tool, but we are using it as an integral part of our, I have to say, English curriculum. They have a lesson in the library. All students in Key Stage 3 and Year 10 have a lesson in the library every fortnight. And a part of that is using Reading Plus. They don't come into the library to use Reading Plus. There are other structured activities, whether it's teacher modeled reading, whole class reading, reading groups, reading interventions take place. There's a lot that happens, but that is integral to it. And then in Key Stage 3, all of the students, they're only, and this goes back to that marking issue, their only independent study, what we call homework, is to complete their Reading Plus assignments for that week, which the default is 5 readings and 1 vocabulary. But we're starting this year to alter that for those very proficient readers who what we're hoping to do is get them to read fewer, but maybe use them in a more holistic way. Maybe do some writing around that. We're using the writing module that's there. Maybe do some oracy. We're not sure exactly where that will take us. We're trialing some things and we'll see how that feeds into the process. But we'll let the students get on with that. We'll be monitoring their usage. But again, that real-time marking, that feedback, every morning I can go in and see who's got a certificate because they've leveled up, who's made combos. We can use the leaderboards in a way that sorry,
what's a combo? Did you say combo?
So the students, Nick, I'm sure you'll jump in too, but the students, they read a text and they do their comprehension questions and they need to reach that threshold of 80%, and then they go and they do another one. That combo is 2 texts where they've made that threshold and it makes a link. Then they go on to the next one and they'll read another text and make 80%. But if they read the 4th text and they drop below that, they have to get another combo. They've got 1 combo, but that second pairing doesn't count. And so you can reward them in lots of ways on, how many words they've read, on how many combos they've achieved, on the different streaks that they've had. There's so many ways to try and feedback positively, because that's so important. You can't just say you're not doing something, but this shows them that they can do it. And that goes back to the story that I told about that Year 9 boy who absolutely beamed because he was getting that virtuous loop from what he was doing, how it was feeding back to him. But the teachers, sorry,
I was going to say, is that those tests that they get the combos on, are they based on individual texts or are they based on a series of texts?
They are in the personalized library, the content library that opens up based on the achieved proficiency score in that initial assessment. And so there's an element of autonomy in there, or agency. They can choose text to read. It will nudge them if they're choosing too many at my school, football or sports stories. So it's trying to push
How
them
does it
out
do
and
that?
boost their background knowledge across a number of areas. I mean, it's one of the things I love, and it gives the students feedback as well on what they're reading and how they're doing, how many things they've read in those different threads. I mean, it's just phenomenal. And it gives you information about the children, the students as readers, their motivation, what they like to read, which you can hopefully then use and translate into that whole reading an actual book and turning the pages. But one of the things I was going to say is it helps the teachers too, because it's automated. The teachers don't have to mark. You can go in the morning and you can see who did what you asked them to do and how well did they do it.
No, that's absolutely superb. Yeah, and I'm presuming from what you mentioned, like a streak before. So is that sort of like a Duolingo type thing?
I gather it would be much the same, Nick, if you want to talk about that. It's gamification, I suppose.
It's just the number of texts they've read at 80%, and they get rewarded for that. So again, you're right, Charlotte. The combo is the 2 texts at 80%, and it's like a link in the chain to get to level up. So what the program wants you to do, it wants you to level up. It wants you to move from you might be in year 6. And you might be reading a library, which is year 5 related in terms of text complexity. It wants you to level up, depending on your
Boris Johnson style.
Depending on your other scores, it will give you a range of combinations. So you might need to get 10 combos to level up, so 20 texts. But it wants that consistency. So it wants to see you read the text. And to get 80%, you're given 10 really complex, the comprehension-based questions, but they're really robust questions. Not just inference. Well, I think inference is difficult anyway, but they go on to the higher order thinking skills, recognizing different points of view. There's comparative questions within the program. So, and it does have a gamification feel. It's like an intelligent Kindle, really. That's the way that I would describe it.
That's what I was just going to get at. And I was going to ask Charlotte as well on that, is whether that competitive element, because I've seen that with different programs in schools I've worked in. It's worked really well. Yeah. Not just for reading, but for in other areas, right? If there's some sort of, I say competitive element, it can just be competition with self. So it can be, I've managed to move up this many levels, whatever, right? So what I was interested in, Charlotte, within the school is, do you sort of publicize anything, or do you just say if they want to talk about it, they can, or do you have like leaderboards or anything like that? Or I know like can be controversial, but it's worked. Like in one school I was in, worked really well. It wasn't with Reading Solutions, it was with something else. But they basically gave out certificates for different things. And it was all linked to progress within this particular program.
So we do try and use it and publicize it. One of the things, we have a history of using our pastoral teams as well. And the deputy heads of year are sort of charged with overseeing, I won't say reading, but sort of reading success and reading engagement in their year groups. And when we were using Star Reading and Accelerated Reader, we did some sort of feedback in the weekly collective worships and awarding, you're the star of the week or whatever, and we give positive points on our class charts. So we do use it that way, but I think that there's lots of scope for us to be using it much more widely and supporting the pastoral teams and being able to spot things and really talk it up. But again, we run into that problem of time, first of all, and resource, but also, do they understand it? Do they understand what they're talking about? And we have had some problems before where it's not quite clear, so they're maybe rewarding the wrong things. But we give out the certificates. Last year, I gave out somewhere around just approaching 800 certificates to students who had leveled up between, year 7 and year 10. Because, like I say, we are using it as part of our daily practice. Yeah. It's not just an intervention tool, but it is also our first line of intervention across other departments. But this year we have leaderboards. We want to use those more widely, and we want to sort of try and go school to school. So the Reading Solutions has some great things with usage heroes and other kinds of things that we're going to be trying to implement so that we can try and build in our trust, because I've talked about it so much that I've got some of my other trust schools to be taking this on board. So it would be really interesting to see how that motivates. But I think, Tom, the point that you make out about intrinsic self, competition with yourself and trying to do better, I have seen that definitely in practice with this, where students are really, really engaged with the program and wanting to get those levels, and disappointed when the combo breaks or they don't move up.
Could I ask a quick question?
Yeah,
Tom?
go on,
Nick, how often does the program generates a report, and who gets it?
Well, it's automated. So when the students level up, the program just automated alerts the staff, and you can just click a button and it will generate the certificate. There are also other awards that are linked to the student interface to do with combos and gaining powers. So when a student gains powers, it might help them if they don't get 80%. We have a website full of downloadable resources for schools and packs. You can get leaderboards, charts, etc. I mean, the leaderboard, just listening to Charlotte there about the leaderboard, it's fantastic. I mean, I had one school, it's very quick, I won't name the school obviously, but one school that went on a pilot and then purchased the program very quickly, and it became a competition with just what you mentioned, Tom. It became a competition between the different classes.
Yeah, I've seen that with a different program, but the results were impressive. Yeah,
they were, because in a relatively small space of time from the pilot. I mean, they ran a 4-week pilot, and then they purchased, but they read 1 million words within this primary school, 1 million words, which was phenomenal. I mean, it really was.
Yeah, definitely.
The reason I asked, Nick, is because I've seen similar programs, but often the teachers don't even bother to check the report, where it generated the report, sent it to the class teachers. And as the head of English, I found that I was doing a lot of the admin checking. But you're saying this is more automatic than that.
You don't do any admin. You've got to engage with the program, and you've got to buy into it. It's like anything.
Haven't you? You've got to check it.
Yeah, you've got to believe. I mean, it works best. It works best when it's embraced and it's incorporated into your curriculum, and there's buy-in, the staff believe in it, there's enthusiasm there. But you've got to monitor it. You've got to log in. You're right. So you've got to log in. You've got to monitor, look at the leaderboards, look at the data. There's high interest, very high, intelligent data within the interfaces and the widgets that you can just click, 2 clicks, and you can do all sorts. What I will say as well, it's not just tracking. It's not just tracking the reading. It's tracking the skills gaps analysis. So going back to your question about what you do after an assessment, well, what we do as teachers is we analyze the assessment and we make allowances. The marking process and that analysis can take time. Reading Plus does that very quickly, almost immediately after every assessment, after every comprehension, everything, and it will we actually have resources on the platform as well, downloadable resources, lesson plans, visual graphs, visuals, worksheets, visual tools. They get emailed direct on the platform to the students, but you can download them to do one-to-one work. And that's the other thing as well. What's the process of what happens next after assessment is really down to the school and the culture and the leadership, and reading. So what do you do next after you've done a reading assessment? How do you do that? Do you identify groups? We talk to a lot of schools right now. They're talking about the challenges they're facing with pupil premium students, disadvantaged students, wanting to do something different with those types of students. That costs money and resource.
Okay. I want to move on a little bit now, and I'm going to go to Chris on this one first. Is what are some tips or best practices do you think to implement closing the gaps that are highlighted in assessments? Now I'm going to pitch that to you, Chris, in a general sense. So just when you do assessments in your school, with Key Stage 3, what do you do to to implement changes to close the gaps?
So one thing we do quite quickly, speaking from the English department perspective initially, is we make decisions about how we adapt our existing curriculum resources. So we might make decisions to move away from one particular unit and move towards another, because we're not restrained by the national curriculum in the same way that state schools are. And we might make specific decisions about how we offer extra support to individual students in class, and then also how we plan out their intervention program for them as well. So in our context, it's more really most students present with some kind of gaps when they're coming in from different education systems. So we're quite used to each year seeing fluctuations in reading ability in each year group when they enter the school. So we have to make quite quick decisions on how we adapt things there. So I suppose one question I would have for Nick, actually, based on our experience, we did previously use a digital reading tracking program that also developed their skills. One of the reasons we moved away from it was the instability of our population, because we take students in each of the 3 terms. So I wondered how well your system was able to adapt with students coming and going mid-year.
What do you mean? What do you mean, Chris?
So, for instance, we might have year 10 students join us in September at the start of the academic year, and a different cohort come in January of year 10, and another cohort come in a bit later on in the year. So how it deals with tracking
it tracks
students at different entry points.
Yeah, because it's fully automated, it starts with the baseline assessment, and the process is it baselines the students, it puts them into startup mode, it's checking the baseline assessments, and then it's giving that student that personalized pathway. So essentially the students are, from start to finish, it's their interaction within the program and their usage. So that's how it deals with it. You can remove students at any point from the program. You can because the way that it works is we sell licenses and they're reusable. So you can have that fluctuation. But in terms of making rapid progress, we would typically want to see about 8 weeks of usage to get accelerated progress in terms of fluency. But the program's because the program, Chris, is fully adaptive. It just enrolls the students onto the platform, and then it's literally down to the students to. There's no teacher instruction. The program does everything for you. What we're asking staff to do in schools is to provide that resource in terms of building it into your curriculum. But who's on the program is really down to you. You can make informed decisions about who you put onto the program and how long they're on the program. Our typical gains after 8 weeks, our typical average gains after 8 weeks of usage are 20 to 30 words per minute in terms of fluency with understanding, which is significant, and between 1 and 1.5 years in terms of text complexity here. So, but I understand it's difficult to manage those situations and those groups of cohorts, but the students can access the program as well because it's online. The students can access the program at home as well.
Thanks for that, Nick. We're now moving towards the very end, and in fact, this is our last question, which I'm going to pitch to Charlotte initially, and then feel free to jump in, probably Nick on this one, but certainly Charlotte first. I want you to just tell me, Charlotte, in a minute, how you use Reading Plus to identify and close the gaps.
It starts with that initial assessment, and it goes on from there. I should have said this when we talked about what do we do after assessment. That information has to be shared across the school. And so it is uploaded and is used widely. It's part of the system that we use for setting homework and doing seating plans. It appears on those, so teachers can use those data to be able to, in the classroom, put people together who, it will be just instructionally useful to pair them up or separate them or whatever. But the school that I'm in has 30% disadvantage and 30% free school meals. We have all of these demographics that we're looking at, and we're very, very clinical about tracking them. So we know who those students are. We'll go right to this instructional report. We'll go right to these data. We'll marry them up, and we'll say, what do we need to do to support those students? And that, again, is communicated across the school, whether that's a bespoke sort of intervention program, because we have a resource base. We have some other kinds of centers where we can put vulnerable students or students who need maybe extra instruction. We can actually use those alongside what we're doing in curriculum areas. So there's all sorts of ways we pinpoint and use those data.
And Nick, just briefly, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think you've summed it up really succinctly, Charlotte. I think it is really understanding what the need is, isn't it? Yeah. So it's that identification of it's measuring what matters, measuring it accurately, and you know, as a senior, I was 25 years. You know, there's a lot of waste in the education system. Invest in something that works. You know, you've got to implement things that have real impact. So you've got to measure what matters. And what I would say as well, again, there's a summative and a formative element to the program. You can baseline assess the students 3 times in an academic year. And the formative side of the educator site is the fact that you are tracking and monitoring every single interaction that the students have on the interface. And you're able to use that and make decisions, you know, real decisions in terms of what you do next as a school. So that's all I really have to add with that, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nick. So, listen, we are coming toward, that is it. We have done it. It was a fantastic conversation. I just want to say a massive thanks to Charlotte and Nick for joining us. Nick, I don't know if you want to very quickly tell our viewers / listeners, because this will be available as a podcast, if you want to tell them how they can get this 4-week pilot, this free pilot. They've listened for 90 minutes now. How do they actually get it?
Yeah. Well, basically, if you just go on to, the best way is to go on to Reading Solutions UK, the website. If you go onto the website, you'll be able to get access to the free 4-week pilot. It's just a very quick form that you would fill on the website. There's no obligation at all to purchase. We're that confident that, you know, if you use the program, you'll see the benefits straight away. What I will say about the company is that we work with 1,600 schools across the UK. 160,000 students are using the platform. What you'll find with Reading Solutions is that we are very ethical. We're committed to improving outcomes. There isn't a hard sell in what we do. We're passionate about what we do and support in schools, and we have a fantastic team of consultants, really experienced from different backgrounds. So I would just get onto the website, and I'll just add, Tom, as well, that, you know, in 2023 we produced a Key Stage 3 white paper on the challenge, the impact and outcomes facing secondary schools. I'd really, you know, encourage people to go onto the website and download that white paper and read it, because it covers a lot of the topics that we've discussed tonight on the show.
Superb. So yeah, I have to say, it's been great to learn a bit more for me as well, particularly towards the end there about the sort of competitive elements to it and stuff. I just think it's really interesting, and the digital element to it as well. So thank you very much indeed. I have to say a big shout out to my fellow TTR teamers. We've got Michelle and Doctor. When did you become a doctor, Christopher? When did that happen? That must have been recent. I've never seen DR on the screen before.
2006.
All right, not recent, just haven't noticed it ever in the last 2 years. So massive thanks to Michelle and to Dr. Christopher Vowles and to Lucy Newberger, who was in the background tweeting to her heart's content about the wonderful things that have been happening here. So thank you to her as well. And of course, to our viewers who've been watching all the way through this evening. We will be back tomorrow on TTR with more shows. As always, every day there's a show. Hannah Wilson is on tomorrow evening at 7:30 p.m. Get yourselves over to watch that live on YouTube and live on X. She's talking about diversity and equity in the curriculum. So definitely give that a watch from 7:30 p.m. tomorrow live with Hannah. That is it from us. Thank you very much, everybody, and good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Outstanding, a world-class vision, a world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.